The first wave of feminism was concerned with getting the vote. Um, in the 19th century, women were initially concerned with or focused on the abolitionist movement, and that is the abolishment of slavery. And they realized in the course of advocating for or against slavery that they really didn't have a public voice. And what it meant to have the public voice was to have suffrage or to have the right to vote. So their goal was to get the right to vote for women, because women didn't have that right to vote until the until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Uh, but note that it took them from 1840 until well into till the second decade of the 20th century to get the right to vote. And they didn't have the right to go vote because men did not believe, men and society in general did not believe that women should be active in public affairs, or in politics, or with governing. They believed that women belonged in the home and hearth and in the kitchen. That was women's rightful domain. So it took them a while to get the vote. Second wave feminists, 20th century, 60s and through the 80s. This is kind of what we know as feminism today, what we associate, the images, the goals of second wave feminists is how we define feminism. It's the predominant image of feminist. They sought equality in the workplace and education, and also in their role as citizens in all of the civic proceedings, divorce, in getting money through the banking system, and also in owning property. You were at a disadvantage if you were a woman and trying to or engaging in any of those civic activities. They were also concerned with sexuality and reproductive rights, birth control. There were attempts to limit women's access to birth control. There were many in the religious community that thought that was sinful or against the laws of God to try to control when for a woman to control when she bore children. Along with that, abortion rights, same thing, except the belief, of course, the anti-abortion folks believe that was in fact, killing a child. And so I'm sure that you know about the struggle the over abortion. It actually still continues today. So that was a concern even in the 1960s for feminists, that women be able to control their bodies. Second wave feminists were very successful in the laws that they were able to get passed. They were certainly very active in the streets and in their protests and in their positions and in their positions, excuse me, in their petitions and in boycotts, and in the pressure that they placed on members of Congress. And so they were instrumental, I should say, in getting a lot of this legislation passed. The National Organization for Women was kind of the clearinghouse for a lot of feminist activities or women's rights activists. So that represented them getting organized and having a central place to kind of coordinate a lot of the national activities that were um, aimed at getting women's rights. And then 1973 was Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion, and that struggle, as I mentioned in the previous slide, still continues. Title IX was another landmark legislation in 1972 that prohibited the use of federal money to support any sort of sex discrimination in all education programs. So if you got federal funds, if your institution at all levels, any level, got federal funding, you could lose that federal funding if you were discriminating on account of sex. The Equal Rights Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment was also legislation that they tried, or not just legislation, an actual amendment to the Constitution that they tried to get passed from, I guess, the 1970s and well into the 1980s. But that was they were on their way to getting it passed, but the anti-ERA forces stopped them. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it was a proposed amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing equal legal rights for all Americans regardless of sex. So it was, being very explicit, amending the Constitution to explicitly address discrimination on account of sex. It also sought to end legal distinctions between men and women in matters of divorce and property and employment. The sustaining women's subordination was when we think about it, I guess intellectually, and we think about it from a rhetorical and also a critical perspective. When we look at why women were subordinated to men, there are a couple of reasons. There are a few reasons. One, it was tradition. It was the way people thought it should be. It was some people believed, men and women believed, it was actually God ordained that women should be subordinated to men, that men were put on this earth to lead. So it was traditional thinking that was also reflected in law, which is why women had to lobby to get laws changed. And it was reflected in discourse and language and the way men and women interacted and the way women were treated. So when you look at that episode of Mad Men, and you see how women were talked about, how women were talked to, and how women even saw themselves. You see how feminists and women's rights advocates sought to change the way we even thought about women and how we talked about women and how we engaged women. Because that was an important part to elevating women's status in society, is that you see women differently. You did not see them lower than men. You didn't see them as just emotional creatures. You didn't see them as not as intelligent as men, but you saw them on equal par with men. And the idea that women were equal to men was offensive to so many people. It's hard for us today to, those who didn't live it, to really wrap their brain around the fact that women were just perceived as secondary to women, or subordinated to men. And the media's part on that, well, of course, was the stories that they told. The stories that they told both shaped and reflected the current beliefs about women and their subordinate position and their rightful place as being such in society. And so that was why feminists were concerned about media, the images of women in the media, because that became a real important goal in changing the mindset of society. Early feminist communication scholarship were concerned with everything on the preceding slides, but other things as well. The underrepresentation of women in professions in general. There were certain professions that were just not open to women. The idea of a woman being an airline pilot or a firefighter or an executive in corporate America was just, even in the 1960s, Mad Men, think about Mad Men, was just unheard of. So underrepresented in the professions in general, but also in the academy, professors. Professors were mainly men as well. They were concerned about stereotypes, these one-dimensional images of women that showed women only in a certain way, did not show them as intelligent, did not show them as powerful. And those stereotypes, feminists believe were part of the problem, and they needed to change those mindsets. And in changing those mindsets, it's changing the socialization process, or the ideas to which everyone in society was socialized to the idea that women were to be subordinated to men and did not need rights, and did not need their rights protected. They needed protection, which meant that they weren't strong enough to protect themselves. That was the perspective. But so feminists wanted to change how people were, or how society was socialized. Also, part of the socialization process was gender identity, what it meant to be a woman, what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be an ideal man or an ideal woman. And so feminists um, uh, thought that baked into, or the construction of an identity, a collective identity for women, was this weak identity that reflected a group in society that needed to be protected and did not in any way, could not in any way, shape, or form lead. So they wanted to change socialization. They wanted to change the ideas about gender identity, in particular, perceptions of women. Pornography was another concern with early feminists in their scholarship. They were concerned that pornography dehumanized women and women's body parts, and that led to domestic violence. That dehumanization, looking, objectifying, dehumanizing women that occurred in the images in pornographic literature undermine the humanity of women. And so that was another concern for early feminists in general, and also those communication scholars in particular. So second wave feminist critique of the media, along with that pornography, were these sort of the connection between those images and violence. That feminists felt in general that the media perpetuated gender disparity, the differences between men and women, and of course men residing on top. They sought to change the quality and quantity of the images of women in the media, in news and entertainment media. They also, the quantity of those images were limited. The quantity of images of empowered women in particular were limited, and so they sought to change that. The hegemonic images of women, how women should look or how they should act to be considered good women. Early feminists or second wave feminists had a problem with those images. They believed that, of course, women themselves were socialized to the idea that they had to look a certain way, they had to act a certain way to be upstanding, to be respectable, to be desirable women. And so there was this real narrow notion of, who women were, what it meant to be a good woman, and who was attractive. Even notions of attractiveness were very, very narrow. And all of that, second wave feminist asserted, was driven by the media and this constant barrage of this one-dimensional, one type of image, one body type, one skin color of women, always being held up as the ideal. And so that was their criticism, and they sought to change the media in these terms. Beginning in the 1980s, society began to change as a result of the efforts of feminists. A previous slide presented some of the legislation that advanced the feminist agenda, but there were also gains made on the images on television. Bonnie Dow in 1996 wrote a book about primetime feminism, and she starts to trace the changes in the images of women and women's stories being represented on television. We recall that we said that television mirrors and reflects society's impressions and beliefs. And so she looks at the trajectory of, beginning in the 1970s, the trajectory of those changes and how feminist ideas and ideals began to be incorporated in the stories, in stories about women, or television shows that featured women. So her book sort of interpreted the social change as reflected in these primetime shows on television, and how television was a kind of managed the cultural impressions and started to manage this change that was happening. It sort of managed, calibrated, reflected the change that was happening in the mindsets of society about women. So this is just a collection of the shows that she that she analyzed. So Mary Tyler Moore, I showed you this slide earlier, was baseline feminism in the 1970s. And it just kind of legitimated feminism in a way. It was a working woman. She didn't have a romantic partner. She dated, but she didn't have a romantic partner. She didn't get married by the end of the series. Mary Tyler Moore herself, as a character on television, was very what we used to call wholesome. Um, she was relatively conservative in her appearance and in her manner, and so lots of women could relate to her. So we call her baseline feminism. Designing feminism, it was kind of the backdrop for post feminism. It doesn't talk about feminism per se. It sort of presumes an equality for women. So it doesn't beat you over the head with it. Feminism isn't discussed. It wasn't discussed in Mary Tyler Moore either, but it's not discussed here. It shows that society is sort of making the adjustments to the idea that women are equal. It's interesting that it's conditioned by a Southern identity, and it's interesting the tension between Southerners, especially because of the religiosity, the Christian religiosity, tend to be more conservative. So Southerners really didn't take kindly to, I guess, feminist or feminism. And yet, it's enacted in the way that some women live their lives, both in reality and also on the show. So, as Southern women, they didn't talk a lot about feminism, but they were all single. They were building their business. They had to face down systems of discrimination. So, you saw them act out the women fighting for their rights without really talking about feminism or women's rights or aligning themselves with the women's rights movement. Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, was another show that was another reflecting feminist ideals without talking about feminism, and it's embodied in characters that regular women could relate to. It's interesting that regular women couldn't relate to feminists in reality. They saw them as loud, they saw them as radical, they saw them as, just out of touch with them and their lives, that would later become a criticism of the feminist movement. But the women that you see here who are reflecting these feminist ideals are very relatable. So Dr. Quinn was a privileged white woman who was from Boston, left her privileged lifestyle in Boston, chose not to get married, went to the frontier, wanted to practice, wanted to be a doctor on the frontier. And she ends up, adopting 3 children and then marries an unconventional man who you can tell sees her as a partner. So her life, feminism and feminist ideals are reflected in her life without really talking about it. They call it difference feminism. It's like we don't, it's, she is the embodiment of traditional femininity in the way, traditional white femininity, and the way that she looks and the way that she comports herself. And yet she's super tough, the smartest person in the community, an implied leader in the community. So everything that feminists wanted for women, you see reflected in Dr. Quinn. By the way, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, is set in the 19th century. So it's not even like it's the 20th century. So it incorporates kind of non-feminist, feminist goals and ideals on the one hand, but intentionally feminist on the other. And it also reconstructs contemporary issues. It dealt with some of the issues that were tangential to feminism, or that were to the fight against gender prejudice. So racism. They dealt with racism. They dealt with sexism, and they dealt with classism as well. So so TV started reflecting the gains that women made because of second wave feminism. But there were some challenges. It was, women had fought for the right to have it all, but it was difficult to have it all. It was difficult to have, maybe a work life balance. You got this opportunity, but you were still expected to be a mom. You were still expected to run the house. Society expected that of you. So constructed in the idea of what it meant to be a good woman was you got to be a good mom, you got to run a great house. Now, I don't think that women have those kinds of strictures today, but in the late 20th century and even early 21st century, there was still that pressure to be a wife and to be a mother. And there was still also residual sexism that you'll see even today with the Me Too movement. So television did reflect the gains that women had made. So feminism did advance on all fronts. The movement made gains, but they were still seeking power. You know, they still in media, where media was concerned, wanted equal representation on screen, wanted equal more power in telling stories. There were still, as a result of second wave feminists, there were different uh, I guess, activist scholars were looking at, in our case, television and televisual text through the lens of feminism, the feminism as a theoretical and a methodological lens. They were thinking about it in terms of intersectionality, where women of color were concerned and women of different classes were concerned. They had ethnographic approaches where you actually started talking to women and not just talking about them, about their experiences. Questioning, there was also a questioning of gender binary. Do you have to be either male or female? And so questioning, you know, does gender exist on a continuum? So now you have people studying, looking at, talking about, and giving presence to transgender folks, those who are neither, you know, solidly male or solidly female. And that's what's happening when we're talking about, studying feminism and studying gender and talking about gender equality. There's also been conversation about post-feminism, and that's the idea that we really don't need to talk about feminism or don't necessarily talk about women's rights. We've already won that battle, and so, you know, there's no need to think about feminism in the way that second wave feminists thought about it. And so that's now kind of a conversation that perhaps some in your generation are having. I don't associate with I don't associate with feminism. I'm a strong woman, but I don't put that label on myself. And so that's the struggle and the challenge of feminists now, is that people aren't, or were not, that's some people would say it's now reversing, but they're not thinking of themselves as feminism. So hence it's post-feminism. So they're replacing feminist icons with new televisual representation. So Jennifer Gardner didn't think about or talk about feminism. She just was an empowered woman. So that's when we think about third wave feminism and where you are. It's a movement kind of in search of itself and its voice, as women were trying to distance themselves from traditional ideas about feminism. All right, we are ending lecture 2, and I'll see you in a bit with lecture 3 for lesson 5.